Many of us couldn't hide because we were sick and dying, and we had to come out to our families. And more people knew people who were gay and knew people who had AIDS. And that's what humanized us. And that's what forced a lot of us to come out and more of us to be known and to begin to be more widely accepted. So perversely, the illness that was killing hundreds of thousands of us, in fact, accelerated our civil rights. Hi, this is Mike Balaban. Welcome to another episode of BAMMER Talks. Today I'd like to give you a little history lesson on the pace of progress in LGBTQ rights in the United States. This is because I recently did an episode of BAMMER Tales where I described what it was like for me personally growing up as a gay man in the deep south of the United States in the 50s and 60s, and how scarring that was and how painful and slow it was for me to finally be able to accept who I was as a gay man. But a lot of people got the impression that things changed rapidly after that we left the 50s and 60s behind fairly quickly and metamorphosed into an era of much more welcoming civil rights for the LGBTQ population. That isn't really the way it happened. In the 50s and 60s, as I've described before, you could be put in jail, put in a mental institution, fired from your job, disowned by your family, cut off by your church, etc., just for being LGBTQ. We were all in our own hidden circles, secretly fearing that we were gay, knowing no one else like that, and believing we were alone. There was no gay community unless you were lucky enough to be in an artistic community in an inner city, maybe in the theater or fashion or something like that. By and large, though, most people who knew they were attracted to the same sex felt they were alone and knew they were illegal and did everything they could to hide from it and to deny it. We got into the 60s and the countercultural revolution began. Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, the flower power, the hippie revolution, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and that spirit of rebelliousness carried over to a gay community. But again, there wasn't a community. Carried over to gays beginning to feel like we deserve some rights too, but we still could be arrested in bars for dancing with someone of the same sex, or for touching somebody else of the same sex. Our bars were raided by the police regularly, and we could find ourselves in jail, and we could find ourselves out of a job as a result of having our name published in the newspaper after a bar raid. So you had to be very, very careful. We all who knew we were attracted to members of the same sex did everything we could to hide and to deny it to ourselves and to root it out. Obviously, that doesn't work, and eventually we all had to deal with it, but it was a very slow process. And even though we only slowly began to realize who we were and that we were, many of us, not just alone, and that there was a kind of a burgeoning community, it did happen. In places like the Castro in San Francisco, Greenwich Village in New York, gays began to congregate in groups and to form a sense of community. And we discovered our sexual freedom slowly. In 1966, there was the Compton Cafeteria riots in San Francisco that was around a transgender issue. In 1969, the Stonewall insurrection that is more famous, where gays fought back for the first time. And it's really set the stage for a wide-scale resistance by the LGBTQ population in demanding our rights. Now, that was the start of the process. It took 20 years for it really to be achieved. In the early 70s, we began to recognize that we weren't alone. Each of us who thought we were the only one of our kind found others. We met in cities like San Francisco in the Castro district and the New York City in Greenwich Village, and we formed gay male communities. There really wasn't a lot of space for lesbians. Trans wasn't even clearly an identity then, but we found each other, gay men for the first time. We began to engage in sex. Sexual freedom was key. Now, you have to understand that the countercultural movement of the mid to late 60s and the anti-Vietnam War resistance movement all coalesced in a broad revolution and rebellion across the country by young people, and gay people were only part of that. So the Stonewall riots triggered what happened in the 70s, where we began to experiment sexually and to find community and to go out and dance and party. And for the first time, we were no longer being arrested in bars. The police stopped raiding our bars and arresting us just for dancing with each other or touching each other. And that meant we could do whatever we wanted, or so we perceived. It was a decade of experimentation and abandon. Of course, it would end up costing us in the decade to come when AIDS arrived, but we didn't know that was coming. There was no gay and lesbian community. We had no space for women in our lives. We just wanted to find other men. Meanwhile, the lesbian community didn't have a place to belong. The women's movement didn't welcome them for fear that the world would consider the entire women's movement, the feminist movement, to be lesbian. So women and the lesbians were off on their own until in 1981, AIDS hit. And suddenly men started falling sick with this strange new virus and dying. And women, the lesbians, came to our rescue and nurtured us and nursed us. And that's when there was the first evidence of real lesbian and gay community. In the late 70s, it was kind of like the perfect moment where we felt like we had our freedom. We were starting to win referendum in public elections, allowing us to be mentioned in school books, saying that we had rights to be open as gay men. And we thought we had it. We were on our way. And then along came AIDS in 1981. And it shut us down in many ways. We stopped exploring sexually. We were fearful of dying. We began using rubbers and hardly having sex at all and hiding. But many of us couldn't hide because we were sick and dying. And we had to come out to our families. And more people knew people who were gay and knew people who had AIDS. And that's what humanized us. And that's what forced a lot of us to come out and more of us to be known and to begin to be more widely accepted. So perversely, the illness that was killing hundreds of thousands of us, in fact, accelerated our civil rights. And even in that time, I came out in 1976 at 23, 24 years of age. I was the only person I knew who was coming out at that age. And most of the people I met, I was the first person they ever met who was gay. Everybody else was in the closet. People I knew right up until the late 80s and 90s who were gay, living in New York City, would live in their own individual apartments, even though they had partners, so that everyone would think they were still straight and single, even though they had boyfriends or lovers. They wouldn't live together. So that shows you the lack of freedom, the lack of feeling like you're free to be who you are. It was only in the 90s, as AIDS began to get under control, that we began to see our rights become more widespread. Court cases began to go in our direction. It wasn't until 2005 that same-sex sexual relations, sodomy, became legalized on a national basis. The issue of same-sex marriage wasn't even seriously considered until 2004, when Massachusetts was the first state to permanently approve the right to same-sex marriage. So as one can see, even though in the 50s and 60s was a very dark age, and in the late 60s and 70s we began to explore our sexual freedom, the idea of accepting who we were and being open about it didn't really happen until the 90s and 2000s. And now we're finding once again the specter of underground resistance and hate and anti-gay sentiment in a lot of quarters where we didn't expect. What's happening in places like Florida, which I discussed in my last episode of the Don't Say Gay bill, when they are taking our books out of libraries and claiming that we're trying to groom young children to become LGBTQ, which is not the case, obviously. That has remnants of what happened in the 70s all over again, and we're having to fight those same battles. But at any event, it's a much better world today than it was 50 years ago. The pace of change compared to most minorities has been more rapid than anybody could imagine. There's still battles to be fought. This has been my history lesson about the gay rights movement in the United States from the 50s until 2000. Thank you for listening. Mike Balaban, BAMMER Talks.